Christian, thank you to the organizers for giving me the pleasure to come back here after a few years. My presentation is a bit complicated because so many things have changed over the last few years. I'm going to focus not on catheter infections, but rather recent trends on HAIs, on acquired infections under ventilations, and problems with pneumonia, which are healthcare associated, and also a major part on bacterial resistance, trends, and means of control. First of all, the general background on infection. You know the national surveillance data, which cover about 40% of ICUs in France. When we look at the distribution of infections in those services, pneumonias are over half of the infections, 53%. Then URI, 20%, and so we mainly have pneumonias and bacteremias. So we won't mention catheter infections. There is a high rate of incidence, but the most frequent infection, you see incidence density, there's a reduction in 10% in 2012 compared to 24. So there's been a reduction in pneumonias, and therefore there has been a general trend for a reduction in those infections. Now we're going to look at diagnosis in particular. So this is another slide. Mechanical ventilation-associated pneumonias in Europe 2007. These are European countries. You see that there is a great dispersion of incidence rate, 10 to 15 pneumonias on 1,000 days. When you compare this with the U.S., in the U.S. the rate is about 4 to 5 such cases. So what about this data? The evolution of this rate, this study was carried out in the same network. When you have a bolus, you see the reduction of about 8%, over 50% of infections, and median rates which go down to 0. So half ICUs do not have pneumonias in this network. So one of the major questions here is about diagnosis. European data show major differences in pneumonia diagnosis through protected sampling, for example, 50% of diagnosis in France, but in other countries this is not so important. There are other non-quantitative methods of diagnosis. So why is there a reduction in the U.S.? First of all, there is a publication of all the rates in most states in the U.S. It is an obligation to communicate the rates. And also, over the last 3 years, what is considered as avoidable healthcare-associated infections, well, these are not refunded. And a number of American authors, as this one here, has worked on the new definition, and he offered new means to reduce the rates, to interpret clinical signs as strictly as possible, to interpret RNP as strictly as possible, to require a consensus on the diagnosis between two hygienists, to systematically obtain validation from ICU operators, and also I added the diagnosis for tracheobronchitis, which might be a bit different from pneumonia. But of course, you know that there are limitations to this definition. What is modified pulmonary X-ray, fever and hyperleukocytosis, for example? There are numerous causes of alteration of blood gases and bacteriological diagnosis cases, which are quite varied. So what has been selected by American authors? Well, it is a new diagnosis which is based on VAC or IVAC, ventilator-associated condition, or IVAC, IVAC and VAC. What is a VAC? It is a patient who's stable for a period of 2 days in terms of blood gases, but then there is a deterioration 2 days later on, 2 days after that, and this leads to VAC. If there is fever and leukocytosis and neutropenia, then it becomes infection-related VAC. And if there are pneumonia criteria, it is called VAP. VAP, ventilation-associated pneumonia. This definition is, as you see, extremely, well, it provides the same information. If we compare VAP according to the new definition and VAC according to the former definition, you see here conventional definition and new definition. You see that the consequences for the patient are just about the same. Duration of mechanical ventilation will be different with patients with or without pneumonia, but you have 18 days, length of stay in ICU identical, mortality identical. So what the others say is that the new VAP does reflect the former definition of VAC on the basis of conventional criteria, as such as those we use here. To perform this surveillance, we need automated data, of course, and this is the case in a limited number of ICUs. And this shows a number of benefits in terms of length of surveillance, a much better reproducibility of diagnosis, 0.45. So there's a strong benefit for the CAPA score, 0.79 and 0.45. So to perform a VAP, according to the new definitions, you need 2 days of stability, 2 days of deterioration, 4 days of antibio treatment. So it takes at least 8 days in ICU. The problem in the U.S. is that such control is unit-based. It's unit-based surveillance, not by patient, but by unit, looking at the number of catheters and mechanical ventilation. So if we use the CLOMPAS definition, 8 hospitals, 50,000 days of ventilation, and at the bottom of the slide here, the length of stay or the length of ventilation. 75% of patients cannot receive new VAP because the median length of ventilation is below 7 days. So there is a true problem of mismatching between the numerator and the denominator here. So benefits and disadvantages of this new definition. First of all, well, there is a better reproducibility, that's for sure, to reduce subjectivity. So it makes surveillance easier. It enables comparisons between institutions, and it promotes prevention strategies. But on the other hand, we include VAP. We include in VAP, including VAP in the larger concept of VAEs. This might be a problem. And if we look at the outcome here, we look at patients who have been ventilated for at least 5 days to meet the definition. Well, 77% of them have at least one VAC episode, which is a figure which is much higher than what was published so far. It was only 20 to 30%. But then if you reduce to patients with only with 5 days of ventilation, it's 77%. And therefore, this leads to nosocomial infections, of course, pneumonia in the first place, but also non-infection events, atelectasia, pneumothorax, thrombophlebitis, cardioversion, all those things that really require prevention methods. Second issue in terms of pneumopathies that are associated with healthcare, and ATS has the definition in 2005, a definition which was drawn and derived from bacteremia definition. So it is associated with healthcare after a hospitalization of at least 2 days in the last 3 months. Residence in SSSR, SLD, HEPAD, home treatment, dialysis in the prior 30 days, and RBM in people surrounding the patient. So which pathogens, SRM, P. aeruginosa, and EBLSC, which may be the pathogens responsible for these events in these conventional structures of ICU. So all this has led to some important controversy, and therefore there was a literature review which has not yet been published, but which is being prepared in CID. It looks at all the studies on healthcare-associated pneumonia and related to resistant bacteria. You can see here the description of those studies. I won't go into the details of them, but I just want to show you this. The reproducibility or the discrimination between studies. Look at these two columns. All of the studies on the left and on the right, prospective studies with a better quality of data collection and of bacteriological documentation. And usually these studies show a major heterogeneity in the data, including in prospective studies. And especially, well, except for the Staphylococcus aureus, where there is a strong correlation between the conventional definition of healthcare-associated pneumonia and the relation with the multi-resistant bacteria. Criteria discrimination. Let's take the discrimination scores. You see here, looking at prospective studies, that the best discrimination is ensured for Staphylococcus aureus methylaire, but not so much for others. And when we look at the origin of studies, here in the US there is a good discrimination, which is not as good in the European studies and less good in prospective studies or high-quality studies. So what can we suggest to improve this? 3 recent studies have looked into the discrimination criteria. Each factor, Shaw, Aliberti, and Shindo studies, quite recent, all of them. How can we propose a risk score? Recent hospitalization is one criterion. Hemodialysis or chronic renal failure, severity, comorbidity, immunosuppression, home treatment, gastric probe. So the scores differ, but in the 3 studies, the discrimination rate is high, between 0.71 and 0.79. Here on the right, you see the discrimination, and when you take 0.79, Shindo's figure, and you see 0.71 and 0.66 with Shaw and Aliberti. These scores were used again for other cohorts in Spain and in Britain, and very good scores of discrimination, as you can see here, compared to conventional scores, HCAP classification. So we may now suggest, as Mirikisin did, a score in the Shindo's papers editorial on the basis of risk factors. We look at whether the patient may be a SAM carrier, and then there is a diagnosis. We try to obtain the germ. If there are more than 3 risk factors, we have a broad-spectrum antibiotic treatment, and then on the basis of the development, then we can reduce the dose of antibiotics. Second part of my presentation, the evolution of resistance. You all know, and you're quite familiar with this, these slides. I'm going to focus on Enterobacteria, the evolution of resistance of Colibacillus 2, 3RG, BLSEs in particular, in Europe, from 2002 to 2012. You see that 11% of these infections were ELBSC, from 2 to 12%. For Calcioiap pneumoniae, 15% of such infection are 3GR in Europe, and France is in the average of European countries. And all this leads to an increase in resistance. These are national data from the BMR national network. The curve has increased. There has been a decrease in SAM and an increase in EABLSE. This increase in EABLSE is not only related to the EABC polybacillus. It is BLSE colibacillus epidemic, as you can see here, with a very high rate of incidence, but it is also an epidemic here in yellow, in blue down there, of Enterobacter BLSE and of KPC.
Alors, si on prend les chiffres...
If we look at the figures here, on the left, percentage, and on the right, incidence rate, you see that the data are not so bad after all. If we look at the data on the basis of prevalence rates 2001, 6, and 12, here we have the resistance rates in green for Staphylococcus aureus, and in red, ERBSLE. We see the infection rate being reduced from 55 to 32%, but for anterior bacteria which are resistant to C3G has increased from 16 to 32%, so double. So 1/3 of such infections are due to enterobacterial bacillus. So here on the left you see ERV, the map of Europe. We are on the bright side with rates below 1%. This is quite reassuring, but this involves a very heavy control strategy. You see in the bottom number of episodes in ELBS with an increase in BCK in 2008 and stabilization of such ERV episodes over the last 3 years. But, of course, this involved a high control strategy. On the right, EPC, the situation is very favorable in France, less than 2% of such infections in France. Almost none of them is EPC infection, but in surrounding countries the figures are much higher, and it's of major concern, especially in Italy and in Greece. Now, for event signaling, things have been evolving very quickly. There has been a considerable increase of such events now being reported. Now, control of ERV and EPC, until last year, this was quite variable. There were specific ERV recommendations and EPC recommendations, especially for patients coming from abroad. But all those guidelines have been reunited into one set of guidelines in 2013. And what is interesting here is that these guidelines are extremely homogeneous for all pathogens, not only ERV, EPC, but also others which are being managed exactly in the same way as ERVs and EPCs. They insist on major risks from repatriated patients, also from patients who were hospitalized in the last 12 months, who enter those bacteria in the hospital wards and especially in ICUs. And they also deal with more flexible measures to adapt to risks so that hygienists and hygiene teams can measure risks and offer adapted measures. They also insist on the screening of what we call contact patient. This is extensive screening and extended over time. Also, very clear guidelines on contact patients who may have an impact on ICUs, because these patients are considered as contact for quite a long time, and then a number of precautions to be taken, and the importance of coordination in the management of such cases. Decisions need to be taken in a collaborative way between hygienists, ICU, and the general management of the hospital, because this has a considerable impact on the hospital itself when such events occur. Then there were a number of publications recently on the attempts to perform skin decolonization. Why should we have skin decolonization? First of all, because of catheter infections, which come from extraluminal and which are related to the patient's flora, but also because in SRLF and ERV, it is very important. So how to go about it? Chlorhexidine with washing and special tissues which are impregnated at 2% and mupirocin as well for SRM. Until then, a number of studies had been performed, and you can see them summed up in a literature review in 2012. When we look at the interest of the benefit of chlorhexidine washing, we see a reduction in bacteremia, and the use of tissues also, there is an over 50% reduction in such bacteremias. Catheter-related bacteremias as well, reduced by about 50%. All these studies were based on before and after data, and here you see the significant reduction, but there is also a significant bias in the previous studies. Now we're going to look at 4 publications, Climo and Milston, the same study, one for adults in adult ICU and the other one in pediatric ICU. Cluster studies, 6 months each, crossover, 9 and 10 ICUs. Adult and pediatric it compares 2% chlorhexidine washing. And the endpoint for adults is multi-resistant bacteremia, and in pediatric services, only multi-resistant bacteria. Then the Milestone study, 10 ICUs, a cluster study, 12 months to 18 months, 2 months of observation, 6 months, 3 types of approaches, screening and additional precautions for carrying patients, decontamination, which is targeted to carriers, and third group, universal decontamination of all patients, whether or not they carry staphylococci. And last and final study, and the leading author is in this room, the Mozart study, 13 ICUs, 3 periods, 6, and after 12 months, with 1 observation, no intervention, and a universal strategy or horizontal strategy, hand washing and decontamination through the use of chlorhexidine tissues, and plus screening of contact patients. The endpoint is all the multi-resistant bacteria, SRM, ERV, HRE, and all the others. The first study, tissues and CHD, bacteremias, reduction in bacteremia risk when all patients are managed with chlorhexidine. Here you see the reduction of BMR acquisition in the control group and in the CHG group, reduction in ERV, and a reduction in bacteremia associated mostly with catheter. The only problem here is when we look at primary bacteremia, there's nothing about Staphylococcus aureus. It's the same figure, but the difference is on the escoagneg and on the mushroom. On the fungus, I'm sorry. targeted decontamination, you see there's a reduction in group 2 and group 3. And when we look at other bacteremia, the reduction is not as significant in group 2 and not significant in group 3, but there is a general trend to a universal decontamination turning out to be extremely useful. But there is no significant reduction. Another set of questions, when we look at SRM bacteremia in group 3, there is not much reduction, but only for white staphylococci. Fourth study, I won't go into, well, I have 3 minutes left, but I will go as fast as possible. Universal measures or targeted measures. Well, hand washing in the universal precaution, 69%, 52%, 77% in group 3, and CHG is very high, 100% in 3 groups. So what is the impact? A reduction of all BMRs, a reduction in SARMs, no impact of targeted measures for multi-resistant bacteria. And what is most worrying is that for 3,3-GR bacteria, there is no measure, neither universal nor targeted, on the reduction of these EBSLE. So the limitation of those studies are judgment criteria. They are much wider in the US than they are in France. The definition of events as well, bacteremia associated or related to CVC, it's the difference with the US. Technical intervention and or the study effect, what is most important, emergence of resistance, and in none of those studies the role of antibiotics is looked into. Now, resistance to CHG. I just want to show you 2 or 3 studies, but I'm short of time. Chlorhexidine is used. When chlorhexidine is used, we might see new strains of new resistant germs, type 1, type B, SMRs, and they lead to the flow of antiseptics, and they raise the issue of transmission of those strains. And 2 studies here have shown the correlation, well, the relation between the use of chlorhexidine and the emergence of resistance. And this might also have an impact in ICUs, and this is something that was published 3 years ago. In an epidemic, we introduce hand washing and then chlorhexidine washing, and we see that when we use a strain which is sensitive to chlorhexidine, there's a good efficacy of intervention C, reduction of 66% of all sounds acquisition. But if we take the TW strain, then there is an increase of such strains when we use chlorhexidine tissues, and the level of sensitivity is different from the other type of strain. Now, this is another study in the Netherlands. They use decontamination of such staphylococci in pre-op, and you see that there has been a reduction. And also, so there is here a possible reservoir of resistance. Short of time, unfortunately, and let me talk very quickly about the possible effects of digestive decontamination. When you use digestive decontamination from the studies, it shows that we reduce the resistance during the intervention, but there might be a rebound effect, and we might see a number of resistance. This is a study published recently in the Netherlands. When we start using dichlochloramicin to decontaminate patients, well, we see ESBL that is less sensitive to colimicin, and here you see the frequency of isolates coli R and tobra R. Unfortunately, I'm really short of time to go into all those aspects, but let me end with the consumption of some antibiotics to show you the national data and the evolution of consumption in this respect. When we look at the French National Surveillance Network, consumption has been quite stable, or at least has not been reduced in our hospitals. Some have been increased. As you can see here, over 4 years, there has been an increase in the consumption of piperazone, cetotaxin, cefotadine, and others. Now, if we go in ICUs, let's look at the surveillance networks. We have a number of results here. Consumption, 1,400 daily doses for 1,000 days patients. And the favorable element might be about barcapinem, where you see that in ICU, the green line, it seems that in ICU's consumptions, after the increase between 2007 and 2010, seem to have been reduced since then until 2012, maybe as a result of the new guidelines on these last line molecules. As a conclusion, we've seen that it's difficult and to ensure surveillance, which is quite variable. There has been a reduction in the rate, but in spite of the complexity of prevention, healthcare-associated pneumonia, for the control of multi-resistant bacteria, the major challenge in the coming years will be EBLSCs, the resistance of prophylaxis agents, ATB, CHG, mupirocin. What should we do in terms of decontamination in those wards when there is a much higher level of resistance? And a new study is going to be started very soon to see the impact of these infections. And we don't know much about the impact of antibiotics in the dynamic of resistance. I would have liked to show you some data about this, but unfortunately I didn't have the time. There are some arguments in favor of the use of chlorhexidine. I have not shown you this about in the net framework of catheter, but it is a good apparently very positive to use chlorhexidine instead of betadine, for example. And in spite of methodological reserves and resistance risk. But in terms of prevention, the Mozart study clearly shows that it's important to look at and to really comply with the hand-washing observance. And this has been done in this Mozart study. And the role of antibiotics should also be integrated in the study on resistance. And this is something that wasn't done in the previous work. Thank you very much for your attention.